Napoleon Bonaparte once said that history is a set of lies agreed upon. It's a quote perfectly suited to a historical figure whose legacy is shrouded in myth and hyperbole, much of which was started by Napoleon himself. And Ridley Scott's Napoleon has sparked some tension on social media about accuracy in historical biopics, like this film including the popular misconception that Napoleon shot a cannon at the pyramids in Egypt, to which Ridley Scott responded, "I don't know if he did that, but it was a fast way of saying he took Egypt. See also, get a life." And we'll talk about how that's all handled in the film, but Napoleon is finally here. I feel like we've been waiting for it for a while, and it's actually putting up great numbers at the Thanksgiving box office, so I feel like historical epics have like good Thanksgiving vibes. You're with your dad. It's also kind of riding the coattails of Oppenheimer and Killers of the Flower Moon, and though I ultimately did like Napoleon, and we'll talk about why, it is definitely the worst out of those three films. I think it's kind of an example of the limitations of historical biopics, definitely a poster child of the good and the bad of a lot of Ridley Scott films, and further proof that almost every weapon of war being phallic is the thematic gift that keeps on giving. There's been a lot of discussion in general about Ridley Scott as a filmmaker lately, especially some of his faults as a filmmaker, and I can absolutely see how his approach to filmmaking and press can strike people as a bit crass. And I'm not a Ridley Scott loyalist. I'm not going to act like he hasn't made his fair share of not so great movies, even though he did make my favorite movie of all time, Blade Runner. But to completely devalue the high points in his filmography and his role in film right now is just dishonest. I mean, the guy made Alien, Thelma and Louise, Gladiator, and he is 85 years old and literally churning out one, like, epic grand scale movie a year right now. They filmed Napoleon in 62 days. I mean, that should, like, not be possible. And he recently said that part of why he's able to make movies so quickly is that he's actually using twice as many cameras. So you're getting multiple angles at once. It can be quickly fixed in post-production. And so he is just not only a juggernaut of a craftsman, but he's a great craftsman, and I think more of an innovator in the industry than people realize. And I see his apathy in his responses to these kind of critical comments more as him showing that he doesn't have anything to prove, because if you watch real interviews with him, he knows his shit, and he's actually very thoughtful about the characters and events that he's portraying. So let's get the obvious out of the way. This is a Ridley Scott historical epic. The battle scenes alone are worth the price of admission in IMAX, and in general, it's one of the most visually stunning films of the year. Just the scope and depth of the imagery, the way light is used, so much of it feels like a moving painting, but it's also often directly recreating or referencing paintings from the time, like his coronation or him standing in front of the Sphinx, which I think is so cool. And a lot of that is owed to Dariusz Wolski, the cinematographer who Ridley Scott has worked with a lot. I also loved the subtle tricks with the blocking and camera placement to kind of dwarf Joaquin Phoenix in the frame, because he's 5'8", so he's not a giant, but certainly taller than he looks throughout the film. I'm sure they made sure to cast taller actors around him, and even factored it into the costume design maybe. Like, his coats always look a little big, and Vanessa Kirby is always wearing heels, so she's taller than him. I absolutely understand the complaints that there could have been more battle scenes in this, but when they are there, they're awesome, they're brutal. There's some, like, cannonballs going through people. There's one scene with a horse that, like, shocked me. It is epic, lean-in cinema. I really have no complaints about this film from that technical filmmaking standpoint. And there have been so many films made about Napoleon and this era, so when you're adding to that cinematic lexicon, you have to have a unique perspective. And so David Scarpa chose to view Napoleon more through the lens of his relationship with Josephine, who was his wife for a while, but played a much more complex role in his life than that. So it's very much a character study, and I see a lot of people saying that that part of the film didn't work for them, but I kind of completely disagree. I mean, Ridley Scott throughout the film is very much playing on the artifice of it all, especially in the silliness of the rituals of the time and how silly and pathetic of a man that Napoleon was in many ways. And I really should emphasize that this movie is very funny, and it has that Ridley Scott almost campy humor, so be ready for that sort of tone. At times, it's almost slapstick.
Destiny has brought me this lamb chop.
But I thought that the truly human core of this film lied in his relationship with Josephine. I thought it actually succeeded in doing that. I found it really interesting how they go through this weird courting stage, and then there's unrequited love, there's heartbreak. I mean, they certainly weren't Romeo and Juliet, but you can see that there was this bond between them that couldn't really be categorized. There were a few moments that really struck me where after some struggle, they put the theatrics aside and just had very, like, honest exchanges about their relationship and sex and power and just how developed it is. I'll put on pause for a moment because we have to talk about the performances. I thought it was interesting that recently Paul Schrader posted that Joaquin Phoenix is an actor that he doesn't get. And I'm wondering if any of you feel that way, because I've actually heard that he was a big draw for why people went and saw the film. And I thought he was good here, especially in delivering the comedic moments, but I don't think that Joaquin Phoenix is a particularly charismatic actor, and that kind of introduced a part of the film that was really missing for me, was that feeling that you understood why people liked Napoleon. This film is critiquing him a lot, making him like this incel-y, whiny man baby, which awesome, I love it. But the reality is that a lot of people loved Napoleon, and I didn't really feel like we got that perspective of the French people of what his appeal as a figurehead actually was. Vanessa Kirby, though, I thought was so good in this. She's every part Joaquin's match, and she's steely and poised. They capture the power dynamic very well through both of their performances. I also really loved Paul Reese, who is also just in Saltburn. He's just got such a great supporting screen presence. However, Rupert Everett as Arthur Wellesley may have been my favorite performance in the film for the like 10 minutes of screen time that he had. I loved his British frown, but he perfectly captured the aura that he needed in order to sell the victory over Napoleon at Waterloo and their final confrontation. Moments that are so crucial to the commentary on Napoleon's masculinity and this connection between sex and his relationship with Josephine and his prowess on the battlefield. In their language at Waterloo, Wellesley says like, "This battle is mine," or something very similar to how Napoleon talks to Josephine, kind of tying in this thread of ownership and power. And again, they're trying to assert dominance over each other with cannons and bayonets. The analysis writes itself. Waterloo is so epic, dude. Better than Austerlitz. I will die on that hill. Just the lushness, the duel between the two leaders, the epic downfall, the square formations. You got like cannonballs whizzing at your face. Austerlitz was probably the more like visually unique in the film. They're both awesome. I wish I could go to IMAX and just watch the battle sequences. Anyways, I'm talking about a lot of things that I liked about the film. I think this is a movie that has more individual good things about it. It just happens to have one very big problem, which is that it's all too nebulous in the end. It clearly got hobbled in the edit, and as a result, this is a film that is less than the sum of its parts. Because no matter how interesting its thematic and narrative efforts are, there's just not enough context or development to give it that full circle feeling. I mean, it's tackling a lot. And with historical epics, you usually have this largely unavoidable problem that you just can't cover everything. I don't even think that Oppenheimer and Killers of the Flower Moon were immune to this. And with Napoleon, I was actually impressed how they coherently showed this whole string from Toulon, his first big victory, all the way to Waterloo. They tag locations and years, which is really helpful, but ultimately you don't get like the full scope of the Napoleonic Wars. That effort is detracting from his relationship with Josephine. It's kind of a highlight reel. And so the pacing really drags as a result. It's a 2.5 hour movie, a bit over 2.5 hours. And on my first watch, I think in the middle stretch, I was struggling a bit, and that was really bad on my second watch. I will say though, I think the third section is really strong. You're rewarded because it ends on a good note. There's this identifiable thread of like Moscow happens, he's exiled, he comes back, Waterloo, Finn. I really like the final scene, and you can see everything that they were going for in that scene. Josephine, it's commenting on how many deaths he ultimately caused despite his victories, as well as his insecurities as a man and as a ruler. I won't spoil it. And so it hits on the quote that I mentioned before, that history is a set of lies agreed upon, and perhaps we shouldn't agree to these lies. I like the one where he rode through the Alps on a mule and he had the painter put him on like this heroic big white horse. So Ridley Scott is certainly aware of these myths, and so I do think that is relevant to the conversation about historical accuracy. Like, there is this acknowledgement of popular misconceptions. Obviously, it's such a core aspect of who Napoleon is, but there also often needs to be an abridged or symbolic representation of things when you're translating it into this medium. And so if you haven't seen it and you're concerned about the historical accuracy, feel free to ask anything specific in the comments, but it's just not something that ultimately bothers me very much, especially when it's meant to be a character study above anything else. There are absolutely valid critiques to make, but I saw someone on Twitter saying like the Prussians didn't come in from that flank at Waterloo, and if that's you, maybe you should just stick to documentaries. So overall, I think Napoleon probably plays out best in the event that that you know some things about Napoleon going in, so you have that added context, and you don't have a huge issue with historical inaccuracies. But there are also things in here that anyone can appreciate, especially Ridley Scott's technical filmmaking for historical epics that just seems easy at this point, and I truly do think is worth the price of admission in IMAX, and at least what it's trying to accomplish thematically, because there are really some great nuggets in here. I think, like, the script is well written, so I'm really curious about that extended cut. But for now, I think the pacing was just totally hobbled by this one, so I'm going to give Napoleon 3.5 out of 5 stars. I don't know, I gave it a 3.5 on my first watch and a 3 on my second watch. I did start to appreciate things more as I wrote this review, but it's kind of a fill rating. I really want to see what the extended cut looks like. It's just a complete unknown when we will get it. But let me know your thoughts on Napoleon, guys. If you've seen it already, if you're just into Napoleon, if you're waiting to watch it on Apple TV, if you're gonna skip it completely, don't forget to like and subscribe and keep an eye out for more videos soon. Thanks for watching.